So good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Cadman. I'm a lead consultant. I lead up the consultancy part of Action Sustainability's business. Action Sustainability is the organisation behind the Supply Chain Sustainability School. We provide the platform and the vast majority of the content that you come and learn from. So today we're going to be talking about carbon reporting for the next hour or so. I'm going to take you through a brief overview around climate change, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it with what's going on in the news and the report that came out on Monday from the IPCC. But just to give some context before we get into carbon reporting itself. So the overview of the workshop for the next hour or so is: why are we reporting on carbon? Where do greenhouse gas emissions come from? What is the response globally and from the UK? And then what do we report? How do we report it? And where do we get our data from? So a bit of a wider package than just the actual reporting mechanisms themselves. So first of all, why are we reporting carbon? I'm sure many of you are aware of this. Excuse me, just while I adjust my screen slightly. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but in terms of the reasons why we're reporting carbon, there's been a huge increase in the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere over the last 150, 200 years, basically since the Industrial Revolution. And what you're looking at the moment is a graph of the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And you can see that for about 800,000 years, it went up and down nicely in terms of how much is actually in the atmosphere. And when it's at a high level, we had warmer periods. And when it's at a lower level, at a trough, we had colder glacial periods. And just to put some context on that, that's when we as a species appeared. So it's been fairly stable up and down through the last million or so years. But on the right-hand side, you can see that it's shot up. It's gone to its highest level for a very long time. It's now somewhere over 415 parts per million in the atmosphere. And that basically means for every million molecules of nitrogen and oxygen and other things in the atmosphere, 400 of them are carbon dioxide. So relatively small amounts comparatively, but very important in terms of its impacts. This coupled with the temperature rises that we've seen, and the IPCC report from Monday highlighted this as well, that globally on average the world's temperature has gone up by over 1 degree Celsius. It's about 1.1 degrees Celsius now. That's the global average. It's more extreme the further north or the further south you go to the polar regions, but across the globe we're seeing increased temperatures, and this is leading to some sizable impacts. I was watching the news only half an hour ago, and it was talking about the wildfires in California and Greece. I'm sure you've seen all the same as well. And just some of the images on here talk about some of those extreme weather events that we've been seeing. And what we've got to remember here is that weather is what we see out of our window every day. Climate change is a longer term trend over 30 years or more. But what climate change does is it's a multiplier. It exacerbates those weather events. It makes them more extreme and more frequent. So all of these events, such as wildfires, droughts, flooding and so on, happen naturally, but they're happening more often and more severely than in the past. And obviously the impact on lives, on livelihoods, on our places of work and on our homes as well. The one that stands out for me is the one in the top right hand corner from Canada and the US a couple of months ago when they had extreme record temperatures because of some of the impacts that climate change is having on our longer term weather systems. So where do greenhouse gases come from? I'm sure many of you will realise the main areas where carbon dioxide, where greenhouse gases come from, carbon dioxide being the most prevalent. Essentially, if you burn any fossil fuel, it gives off carbon dioxide. It's purely the combustion process. So whether it's from power, from transport, from other emissions as well, such as the manufacture of cement and other products. But there are other greenhouse gases as well. Methane is very important too, and that comes from a lot of agricultural processes, but also decomposition, biodegradation as well from composting processes. There's also something called nitrous oxide, which is used, you might have heard of it as Entonox, or you might have heard of it as laughing gas, but it's also used as a propellant gas and other issues as well, other reasons as well. It also comes from the wastewater treatment process in breaking down wastewater byproducts. But then it's a very serious climate house gas as well. Another important one is sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, often used in switchgear, high voltage switchgear as an insulating gas. This and the next set of compounds, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons used in air conditioning systems, are really good at what they do. They're really great at controlling fires because they're not flammable. They're relatively cheap. They are not toxic to us directly. They're not miscible with water, but they have this downside that they have got a huge impact on the climate. And those 6 gases are the main ones that are focused on when it comes to reporting and gathering data on our emissions of greenhouse gases. They're called the Kyoto Protocol basket of 6 gases. So the Kyoto Protocol came out in 1997, seems an age away now, but that linked the effects of climate change to 6 key gases that cause the most impact from what we see. There are other gases that also have a global warming potential as well, but those are the main 6 that we focus on when we talk about gathering data and reporting on our emissions, and they're known as the basket of 6 greenhouse gases. So where do they come from? Greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors. This is one of many different kinds of images that you can grab, that you can see on the internet in terms of where emissions come from. Primarily industry, agriculture, buildings and transport. There are other statistics out there that the built environment leads to about 40% of global emissions, both from the manufacture, construction, and then the subsequent operation of the buildings and assets and utilities that we all use. But this is another way of looking at it and puts those emissions into perspective for different sectors. And you can see energy drives a lot of what we are causing, whether it's directly used in industry or used within buildings, residential, commercial buildings, but likewise also in transport as well. So the global response, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued its 6th assessment report this week, talking about where we're at and what we need to do in the coming years, the immediate response. But just to take a momentary step back, the Paris Climate Change Agreement was probably one of the most important annual Conference of Parties. COP stands for Conference of Parties. It was the 21st Conference of Parties in 2015. It was momentous because we got global agreement on taking action on limiting the average global temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And then that's the marker that we're reporting against when we gather our data and report our emissions. That was subsequently ratified in 2016. Most countries in the world have ratified it. Some countries dropped out, some have come back in, the US in particular, which is really important. And it talked about different countries making their own determined contributions. So the nationally determined contribution, which is what an NDC is. And you can see on the screen there, the UK said that our contribution was 68% reduction of our emissions by 2030 compared to the 1990 baseline. So momentous, it is a marker in the sand. And of course, we've got COP26 coming up in November in Glasgow. The report that came out on Monday is banging the same drum. It's the same message. We need to act urgently. We need to act across all sectors, and we need to have continued action on climate change. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not one thing that we can just do and then it's solved. There's strong, rapid, and sustained reductions across the piece. And the only way we're going to know whether we're doing enough is by measuring it and reporting it. So yeah, COP26 coming up in November in Glasgow, another milestone, and there are a lot of high expectations on what's going to come out of COP26. Bringing it closer to home in the UK, we have something called the Committee for Climate Change, which takes that big picture and says, well, what does the UK need to do? And this picture from the 6th carbon budget that was published by the CCC in December last year looks at what we as a country need to do. So that strong, thick black line you can see is what we've done in terms of our emissions over the last 30 odd years. They've reduced from 900 megatons down to about 500 megatons. It's about a 40% reduction. And a lot of that is from us decarbonising our electricity grid. We've moved away from coal, we still have gas, we have more renewables and so on. So we've decarbonised a lot, but also being more efficient with what we do and how we manufacture. And you can see where we currently are, that red vertical line in the middle. The purple dotted line is what we need to do to get down to the UK's legal requirements, the Climate Change Act, to be net zero by 2050. So you can see it's quite a steady but steep curve down, and what we need to put in place, the actions, the efficiencies that we need to do across all sectors, not just construction and built environment, to reduce our emissions. Different ways of working, different materials, lower embodied carbon, different modes of transport, the whole piece comes into play. So yes, we have a legal requirement to be net zero by 2050. Slight variation in Scotland and Wales. The devolved administrations can do something slightly differently, go at a slightly different pace depending on their economies, but essentially it's the same message. And Ireland in there as well. Unsurprisingly, the Republic has got a very similar target. Totally autonomous, of course, but there's the same trajectory. And about 2-3 months ago, the UK government published an intermediate target, but they made it legally binding. So it was an existing midway point on that purple dashed line, but they made it a legally binding target for us to reduce by 78% by the year 2035 compared to that 1990 baseline. So it's now giving us a milestone along that journey. And again, reporting will feed into this. How are we comparing to this kind of high level UK-wide trajectory? And just to note on a sectoral level, you can see the bar charts underneath where it says CB4, CB5, and so on. Those are carbon budgets. What the UK has a carbon budget of in terms of emissions. What's our emissions budget? How much can we put into the atmosphere so that we can work our way down to net zero? And each sector has a contribution to that. And we're talking construction, we're talking agriculture, transport, these kinds of macro level sectors, and how we can work on pushing our emissions down. I'm sure many of you are aware as well that this is not just about reporting, but this is about procurement as well and supply chain. And obviously the Supply Chain Sustainability School is all about this. The Public Procurement Notice 0621 came out in June. That's what the 06 stands for, just means June 2021. And that's all about government going out and purchasing goods and services. So this is applicable across all sectors, again, not just built environment. But essentially it's saying that within a couple of months' time, any organisations bidding for a public sector contract worth over £5 million per year has to have a carbon reduction strategy as part of that tender. Otherwise, you won't get past the starting line. And this will probably, more than likely, apply down the supply chain as well. It will be cascaded down. So understanding what your emissions are, having that baseline understanding of how much you emit, what you're reporting on an annual basis, and importantly, what you're going to do to reduce that is part of winning work as well from central government and its non-departmental public bodies. So all those kind of agencies that work on behalf of government. There are many other organisations in the public sector who don't come within the scope of this. And there's you can maybe even see it right at the bottom of that little picture. There's something that says in-scope organisations. There are others that are out of scope, but are deciding to adhere to this as well, that they are copying and pasting effect. So it is getting more prevalent. And this comes on the back of PPN 0620, the social value public procurement notice that came out 12 months ago that talked about how we're going to recover from COVID-19, how we're going to tackle climate change, how we're going to build resilience in our supply chains. So these are around, and I wouldn't be surprised if more are on their way as well. So what do we need to report? So before we get to what the actual reporting legislation is or the voluntary mechanisms, we need to understand what we're actually reporting. And hopefully many of you understand this, but for those who don't, very briefly, the language of scopes is really important in understanding how we report our carbon data. It's used as a common jargon now. It's not just for the experts, it's everyone is understanding what these terms mean, and therefore use them in how we're reporting. So this image comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, probably the most widely used standard for understanding and assessing organizational level carbon footprints, and it's a picture that speaks 1,000 words. And two of the main things I want to draw to your attention are direct emissions and then indirect emissions. So direct emissions are coming from sources that are controlled or owned by your organization. And you can see in the middle of the picture, that's called scope 1. So anything that you own or control, whether it's a building, an asset, a vehicle, or you might have a chemical process as part of your manufacturing production line that creates greenhouse gas emissions, that's your scope 1. That's the stuff that you own and control, and you should therefore have data on that to be able to report. Indirect emissions are everything else. So that's essentially where you've paid for a service or a product from someone else, and they are creating that and creating greenhouse gas emissions as a consequence of that. Those are your indirect emissions. Those are split out into two sub-scopes, so scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 2 is essentially power and electricity and heat. So where you've paid a company to create electricity on your behalf, or in some cases to raise steam for another process. They're doing that on your behalf. They're creating the greenhouse gas emissions. You pay for them, so therefore you take responsibility for them. All those other indirect emissions are your scope 3. Essentially, that's your supply chain, your value chain. So components, products, materials that you buy in, services such as business travel, waste collection services, haulage services. Those are your scope 3 emissions. So having that understanding of what scope 1, 2, and 3 are is really, really key to understanding how to do the reporting. And we in the supply chain school have a separate lunch and learn on scope busting. So if you're unsure about that, we have sessions that talk and dig a lot more into this, that spend an hour on this particular topic as well. The downstream side of scope 3 is where you manufacture a product or a service and you sell that on to your customers. So that's part of your value chain still. So it's not just your supply chain, it's your downstream value chain as well. So understanding that is key. And some of the reporting mechanisms we're going to talk about in a minute very much talk about your supply chain and value chain as well. We start at home with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, the stuff you can control, but we very quickly move out into supply chain as well. And just a final point on that, if we are going to get to net zero and tackle climate change properly, we do need to look at scope chain, supply chain and value chain. Many organizations in the construction sector, the built environment, the vast majority of your impact is in your value chain. You know, we're talking 80%, 90%. One example I know of is 99%. So yes, get it right at home first, get your own house in order first, but very much quickly look at your supply chain as well. Another thing I want to talk about is apples and pears. So I talked earlier about carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all the other greenhouse gases. They're not all equal. And this is important to know as well when it comes to your reporting, that they're not all the same. They're not equal in terms of their impact on the climate. And there's a phrase called global warming potential, GWP. And each gas has its own different potential, basically how effective it is at warming up the Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is being given a unit of 1 because it's the most prevalent. It's the one that happens the most often. And it's just a way of relating the numbers to each other. They're not in units. It's not 1 ton or 1 kilo. It's just 1. But in comparison, methane is 25 times more impactful, kilo for kilo, than carbon dioxide is. So in effect, if you emit 25 kilos of methane from your anaerobic digestion plant, that's like emitting 25. If you emit 1 kilo, sorry, that's like emitting 25 kilos of carbon dioxide. So you've got to have that understanding. It's a bit like your foreign exchanges from dollars to euros to pounds to yen. It's kind of converting them. And all of them have various numbers. So I was mentioning earlier that nitrous oxide is really impactful. It's 300 times more than carbon dioxide. SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, used in switchgear, is almost 23,000 times more impactful than carbon dioxide. So if 1 kilo of SF6 were to be released accidentally through a fugitive leak, that's like emitting 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So it's really important to know the differences, that they're not all equal. And one example here is if you've got HVAC equipment, air conditioning equipment, asking your supplier what refrigerant gas they use and what the global warming potential of that gas is. And it will be a number somewhere in the range that you can see on the screen. And clearly you want the number as low as possible, as well as for them to have a good maintenance regime to prevent any leaks in the first place. And the reason we do this is so that we can compare apples with apples. So you can compare your performance to a previous year's performance when you're reporting, or you can compare different subsidiaries within your organization or similar projects, or with your competitors. But if you're quoting methane, nitrous oxide, SF6, it's all a bit jumbled up. So we use these numbers to convert all to carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's where we say, oh yes, I emitted a ton of methane. That's like 25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and you do the conversion, and then you can compare. But again, this is kind of crucial fundamentals for the reporting aspect. Having all this data and being able to convert it is really important. So how should we report our carbon? Onto the core of today's session around carbon reporting. We've picked a few key mechanisms. There are others. We are very much aware that there are other schemes out there, such as the emissions trading scheme and others. We want to focus on the main ones that are most pertinent to the members of the supply chain school. So we've got 4 here. 2 of them are legislative and 3 of them are voluntary. So we're going to take our time and our turn through all of them. So I'm going to focus first of all, obviously, on streamlined energy and carbon reporting. Some people call it SECR, some people call it SECA, whatever. It doesn't really matter. So I'm going to take you through a process of what is involved in these reporting mechanisms, when they came into force, who qualifies, who has to report, what the scope and the boundaries are of the reporting mechanism, and how you should report, where you should report, all those kind of fundamentals of what's involved in this case, SECR. So it's been around for just over 2 years now. It replaced the much maligned carbon reduction commitment, and I wasn't sad to see the CRC die a death. It was overly complicated, both for the organisations trying to report, but anyone trying to work their way through the arcane maze of rules and so on. So SECR is a lot more straightforward and useful. In terms of qualification, it builds upon the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting, the director's report, for any quoted companies on the stock exchange. You've got the London Stock Exchange, the European, the New York, the NASDAQ, various different stock exchanges are included. So if you're a quoted company, you have to report. But the SECR has extended itself to large unquoted companies, LUQC, large unquoted companies, but also limited liability partnerships. And you can see the criteria there. If you've got a turnover of greater than £36 million as an organisation and greater than 250 employees, and there's a balance sheet figure in there as well. If you qualify under at least 2 of those 3 criteria, then you're in. You're part of it. You have to report on an annual basis. So really, really key. You'll notice that £36 million turnover is analogous to the modern slavery legislation as well, in terms of who's in and who's out for reporting on a statement to the Modern Slavery Act. So there's a link there as well. In terms of scopes and processes, and this is why I was saying a few minutes ago, it's good to understand what scope 1, 2, and 3 mean, what greenhouse gas and global warming potentials mean, because this is what goes into the qualification and the scope of what you have to report. So for scopes, you have to calculate your scope 1 and 2 emissions from activities for which you are responsible for. So if you are a quoted company, that's globally. If you're a large unquoted company, it's UK in terms of geographical reach. So there are some differences here. There are some nuances between the kind of organisation you are. Scope 3 is included for your business travel, if you're responsible for purchasing the fuel. Other scope 3 emissions are not mandatory, but they are encouraged. And I would back that as well. I would say that if you are able to calculate your scope 3, then it's a work in progress, but it's something that needs to be tackled as well. Importantly, it's not just your tons of greenhouse gas emitted, it's also the amount of energy you've consumed. So you have a kind of a parallel report, your tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, but also the kilowatt hours of the energy you've consumed, whether that's electric, gas, oil, whatever it happens to be. You can see on screen what that covers. So you have to have that twin report. So it's about energy efficiency as much as it is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions or reporting on your greenhouse gas emissions. There are a few additional requirements as well. It's not just about the numbers. You have to provide at least 1 intensity ratio. So how efficient you are with your emissions per unit of production. So quite often it's done in terms of emissions per pound or £1 million of turnover. But it could be gross internal floor area. As long as there's a well-recognized denominator to make that comparator, then you can do that intensity ratio as well. I should have said earlier, by the way, if you're frantically scribbling down notes, we do share the slides with everybody afterwards. So don't worry about writing furiously or screenshotting every image that I put up. You're welcome to do so by all means, but you don't have to. Some of the additional requirements, because this is annual reporting, you are mandated to report a comparison year on year, what your previous year's energy and greenhouse gas emission figures were for comparison. Clearly, you can't do that in your first year, but from your second year onwards, you need to do that. You also need to state your calculation method. I've already referred to the greenhouse gas protocol. The other well-used approach for organizational footprinting is the ISO standard you can see on the screen, 14064. And those set out the methodology, the approach for how you go about understanding what assets and buildings and transport and so on that you control or you own. There's a whole process around something called consolidation approaches. That's for another training session that we also run in the supply chain school. But having that approach to understanding, well, what are we responsible for as our organization, and getting that boundary as to what's within your reporting scope is really important before you go off and actually gather some data. So setting that up is important, and then quoting that in your report too. Then you need to provide some narrative on the kind of energy efficiency actions you're taking. And those could be anything. There's no prescription there, but it's putting some information there about what you're doing to tackle your carbon emissions. And ideally, that would be enshrined in a carbon reduction strategy, but also some of those discrete actions like the examples you can see on screen about more efficient equipment, more home working, those kinds of things. Reporting is undertaken annually. Starting with your first reporting year after the 1st of April 2019. You undertake that through your director's report, and it's filed directly with Companies House. The CRC was always done with the Environment Agency or SEPA in Scotland, or the other devolved administrations, but this is done with Companies House as part of your director's report. And interestingly, there's no obligation to audit or verify your data. It's strongly encouraged and recommended, and I would back that, but there is no actual obligation to get a third party in to check your data. But if you're doing it as part of the larger report where you might get an auditing firm in anyway to look at your financials, then it would make sense for them to look at your carbon data as well and have a joint assessment out of that audit process, that verification process. Like any scheme, there are a few exceptions and some voluntary reporting that you need to be aware of. Any organisation that uses less than 40 megawatt hours of energy per year is exempt. Now let's put this in context. 40 megawatt hours is about what 2.5 or 3 average UK households use in a year. So if your organisation uses about the same as what 2 or 3 houses use in a year, then you'll be exempt. I think most organisations won't be in that position unless you're a small consulting business, or you're a legal practice and you just have an office. Most organisations will be captured. If you're a subsidiary organisation below the qualification threshold, so if you have less than 250 people, you turn over less than £36 million per year, you may be exempt. And this is one distinction I want to draw your attention to. Whereas with the carbon reduction commitment, for those of you who remember that, if you're a subsidiary and part of the highest parent, as it's called, part of a mothership, you get included anyway, whether you're below or above the threshold anyway. So you have to be part of it. This is different. If you're below that threshold, even if you are a subsidiary and relatively autonomous with it, you can be exempt. The parent company would need to make a statement to that effect to justify it, but you can opt out in effect. And I've talked about the Scope 3 voluntary side as well. The URL I've placed there takes you straight through to the gov.uk website where the more detailed information is provided. So you've got a resource as well if you need to dig into that anymore. So that was SECR. That's probably the most important one, hence why I put it first for any organisation reporting. The next one is the Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme, ESOS. Now this one is called ESOS rather than ESOS. ESOS is a scheme that has remained with us since Brexit. It came from the EU directive in 2012 that you can see on screen, and has been part of UK legislation since 2014. And this is where we need to be careful with some of the qualification. It's slightly different, almost the same, but slightly different to SECR. It encompasses large undertakings, so SMEs are essentially excluded, the same with SECR in terms of employees. So it's that 250 employees boundary above which you are included. The turnover number is different. It's £44 million, not 36. So be aware of that. It's a different qualification threshold. Again, this is different to SECR. It follows the CRC model. Apologies for all the acronyms. It follows the carbon reduction commitment model, that if you are part of a larger organisation that's included, and they are the highest parent organisation, then you are included in ESOS as well. SECR, you can opt out, you can be exempt. ESOS, you can't. So be aware of those. And you'll have to be part of that greater ESOS undertaking for your parent company as part of it. Also importantly, if it's an overseas company that has a UK presence registered in the UK, again with more than 250 employees, they have to be part of it as well. In terms of scopes and process, it is a bit more similar to SECR in this respect. It's calculating your energy use from your activities and your assets that you're responsible for. It's that ownership control piece again. And it's essentially looking at your scopes 1 and 2 again. It's your direct emissions from your vehicles that you own, from the buildings that you own and control, any industrial processes as well. you have to cover a minimum of 90% of your energy consumption. So it's not going after every last single nut and bolt, every last single light switch that's switched on, but all the, the big ticket items where there's significant areas of consumption. And importantly, you need to appoint someone. There's someone who's got a designated role as lead auditor, energy auditor, to undertake those ESOS assessments for you. Essentially, they're going around understanding how much energy is consumed, where it's being consumed, what the hotspots are, and what the opportunities are for reducing those emissions. Where could you put in different equipment? Where could you have different work practices? That kind of thing. So the criteria for that audit, you have to have 12 months of continuous data. Building up that information to take into account seasonal peaks and troughs, whether it's from the weather or from the way your business cycle runs. So you've got an average. You're not picking a particularly high point or a particularly low point. There's an averaging process that goes on there. As I say, you're looking for opportunities for energy efficiency, where you can operate existing machinery more effectively, or you can replace older, less efficient equipment with more modern equipment, or an entirely different approach. It doesn't have to be a like-for-like replacement. It can be an entirely different approach. But there is a caveat that anything that is promoted has to be practicable and cost-effective. This is not about putting businesses out of business. This is about making steady changes and improving as we go along. So making estimations about whole life cost and what the benefit will be. So it's a lot of calculations about what we're using now, what we could invest, what the benefit would be, how much we would save in the long run. So it's using that whole life cost, value for money kind of mentality. That final bullet I really want to draw your attention to. There is actually no regulatory requirement to implement the opportunities identified, which I think is a shocking omission, but that's the way it is. That's the way the legislation is. You get the report saying this is how much energy you use, this is where the opportunities are to save. You submit that, which we'll come on to in a minute, but there's no mandatory reason for you to follow up on that. I think an organization would be foolish not to if it's being properly costed, but there you go. So in terms of submission, as I was just mentioning, you submit your notification of compliance to the Environment Agency on the annual basis. There are, importantly, it's good to know that there are civil sanctions, fines for not reporting on time. So again, this is a bit like the old carbon reduction commitment. There are various fines, £5,000, £10,000 and so on, for not submitting on time or submitting false information. There's various different criteria as to what you can be fined for, but being aware of that as well. So reporting on time, accurately, to the best of your knowledge, all those kinds of things is really important. ESOS comes in reporting phases. So we're in the third phase now, phase 3, that goes on till December 2023. And as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, you report to your environmental regulator in your home country, whether it's Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, SEPA in Scotland, or the Northern Irish equivalent, to log your submission. As I say, I've mentioned the fines issue already. Again, there's exceptions, exemptions. If your organization is fully accredited to ISO 50001, the standard for energy management, you comply. You meet ESOS already because it follows a similar process. What's your energy load? What's your energy consumption? Where are there opportunities to manage and reduce that? It follows the same kind of process. If you don't have that, but you do have other certificates, and I've given you an example there about display energy certificates, they can help you partway down the road of ESOS, so you don't have to do everything. So it's worthwhile understanding what you might have in place already before you jump in feet first into ESOS, if you have to do that. What work you might have already got in place, what data you might already have. And again, there's the URL for you to refer to. Okay, so those are the two main legislative requirements. I'm going to flip on to the voluntary requirements in a second. So these voluntary requirements are becoming more required, if that's one way of saying it. Less voluntary, more organizations are demanding it of their supply chain, of their contractors in the value chain as well. So they're not mandatory, obligatory in the way that the legislative requirements are, but they're becoming more prevalent and expected. That might be the better word. They're becoming expected, but they are still nonetheless voluntary. So CDP is the first one up. Used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, but now they are CDP. They have a broad remit, and they don't just cover climate change and carbon. They cover water and other aspects of sustainability as well, but they're best known for carbon and climate change. And their primary purpose is to gather that information on behalf of their investors, big global corporations who want to know what their risk is in terms of climate change from their suppliers, from their value chain, because they're going to be buying and procuring and engaging with a whole broad range of suppliers and contractors. And it's there to manage risks, reduce carbon, reduce costs, and so on. So it's got the same kind of feel behind it in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Again, it's scope 1, 2, and 3, and you need to indicate in your submission what you're covering, but definitely scopes 1 and 2, and which aspects of scope 3 you're going to cover. Coming to that back to that picture I showed you earlier from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, scope 3 has got lots of different elements to it. There's 15 different subcategories within supply chain scope 3 that you can report on. Working out what's relevant to you, what you can get good data for is really important, robust data. So that's to be indicated in the submission. It's an extensive questionnaire. It's very comprehensive. It's not just about your data, about your tons of carbon, your kilowatt hours of energy. It's a whole bunch of other things you can see on the screen about your business strategy, what you're doing about it, what your reduction process is, the methodology you're taking, how you go about verifying the information. So it's very extensive. It's very, it's very full on processing all that information, gathering all that information. They don't stipulate which method you use. Many will use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol again. It's up to you. You are required, once you're kind of on board, to disclose annually. So once you get over that first year hurdle of what are we doing, it should be a repeatable process. And there are sectoral approaches. So for our sector, there's one on construction. So there are particular ways where it's been adjusted and made bespoke for a particular sector, rather than being a kind of a broad church approach to how we gather data. And there's links discreetly within CDP to other mechanisms out there on sustainability. I've put a few on the slide there, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly science-based targets as well. CDP are part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, one of the founding organizations, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And finally, yes, there's the URL, the web link there to that. So if you are required, or if you are asked to do CDP, giving you a brief flavor of what it's like, and it's a good process to go through, but make sure you've got the resource to do it. It's not all on one person to gather all that information. Okay, Science-Based Targets Initiative, getting more and more well known. I was on a call this morning where they were talking about the business ambition and the race to zero. Science-based targets are very much behind all of this as well. And more organizations are being required to develop their own SBT. So yes, it's good to know what it's all about. As I alluded to a minute ago, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a partnership between CDP, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resource Institute and the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. And they work together to understand what needs to be done, what the mechanisms are, what the details are, and how you get people signed up and become signatories. So again, it's similar. It's a method for any organization to set a target against which they're going to reduce their emissions, and identify what those opportunities are. And I've just put up a brief picture there, that global greenhouse gas emissions and warming scenarios graph. And that's basically what Science-Based Targets is talking to. If we do nothing, we carry on a trajectory in that kind of pink color and the temperature rise that go with that. The more we do stuff, the lower we can bring down our emissions, and also the concomitant rise in temperature globally. So what Science-Based Targets is looking at is the bottom two lines, the one in the kind of purple color and then the kind of greeny aqua green color below that, to keep our global temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally 1.5 degrees. I think that the latest IPCC report basically says, no, we need to go to 1.5. To do that, we need to bring our emissions down. So they are steadily going up, our annual emissions, and we need to, as a world, as a globe, but also organizationally, bring them down so they are in line with that lowest curve in that kind of aqua teal green color. That's what science-based targets is all about. It's fitting your emissions so they fit to that line, that they follow the same trajectory to work out what we need to do. So the way the process works in science-based targets is you commit, you send in a letter saying we're going to commit, and then you have a period of time to work out how you're going to do that and get your science-based target approved. I think there's a 2-year window, 24-month window to get those targets validated and approved. And again, it covers scope 1 and 2. Those are your own emissions that you can control. Even the electricity, which is in indirect scope 2, you can control through your equipment and your machinery how efficient you are, behavior around your emissions as well, and what you're going to do about it. And you can switch supplier if you like as well. But also scope 3 emissions. Importantly, within science-based targets, if scope 3 emissions, your value chain, your supply chain, accounts for 40% or more of your overall footprint, then you have to have a scope 3 target as well. As I was saying earlier, many organizations in our situation, in our sector, are in that situation. You will have scope 3 emissions that are way more than 40% of your overall footprint. And then when you go through the process with science-based targets, you develop a target action plan, how you're going to work out your reduction process, what you're going to do, how you're going to hit your commitment to reducing emissions. And effectively, it's saying we're going to reduce our emissions by 50% compared to 1990 baseline by the year 2035. How are we going to do that? What actions are we going to put in place? What things are we going to do differently, whether it's transport, production process, on-site processes, whatever it happens to be? How are we going to get to that level of reducing our emissions by 50% in the next 14 years? And then, like with many of these reporting mechanisms, we're looking at annual reporting to show what we're doing and show that we're on track and we're hitting our targets. Okay. Last but not least, the Supply Chain School's Climate Action Group. And this is something specific from, obviously, the Supply Chain School that we're doing. Clearly, it's voluntary, but we are getting more organisations within the school engaged, both partners and members to the school. And just to give you a brief view of that before we move on to a couple of other things. So the Climate Action Group has been set up within Supply Chain School, like several other groups that we have. There's one on waste, there's one on plant and equipment, there's others on social value and so on. The Climate Action Group is another working group like that. And we're very much of the mind that we want to be able to take some action on our carbon emissions. And to do that, we need to measure what we're doing. It's all about reporting again, gathering the data, understanding what we are doing, what we're emitting, and reporting on that, finding those hotspots, and then taking action on them. And those that action on those hotspots will help us become more efficient. It'll help us reduce our emissions, obviously, save money ideally, but also be in a better position to win new work as well. So there's all good reasons for gathering your data and reporting on it. At the core of what the Climate Action Group is doing is something called the Carbon Tool. Kind of does what it says on the tin. It's an online calculator that's free to use. We are very, very close to hitting the green button and putting it live, that anyone involved within the school and the Climate Action Group can use. And it's there to calculate our carbon emissions. We're taking the approach of annual organisational emissions. We're not doing it project by project or product by product. You can do that as well, but they are kind of slightly different ways of working and different outcomes. What we're focusing on is organisational footprinting in the same way that SCCR looks at annual emissions as well. The great thing about this tool is that it does apportionment. So if I was a supplier and I was going in and working out what my carbon emissions are, as part of the tool, I can say, I deliver work for these clients, and I can apportion up my emissions by my clients and say, well, 5% of my work is for client A, so roughly speaking, 5% of my emissions go with client A, 10% are with client B, and so on. So you can apportion up. And the benefit there is that your clients can see what is being contributed from their supply chain in terms of carbon emissions. They get a picture of their scope 3 from what you're providing in as a supplier or a contractor. We've got two different kinds of report. Because the school, again, I use the phrase broad church, we have to work with organisations who are SMEs, others who are larger organisations. We've got two different ways of providing data into the tool. If you're a company that hasn't yet done carbon reporting and you're not really sure what you're doing, we go in with the activity data. This is the full report, option B. You put in your activity data. So that's your litres of diesel, your kilowatt hours of electricity, and so on. And the tool calculates the carbon numbers for you. And you can get that kind of data from various different sources I'll come on to in a bit. If you've already done that process, though, if you've already done SECR reporting, for example, you're a large organization and you've already got the answer, you can kind of skip forward and go, well, here's my output from that. But you can still participate and contribute. But it saves you the effort of having to go back in and plug in your litres, your kilowatt hours, and so on. Frequency of reporting, we've set a de minimis of annual in line with SECR, ESOS, all the others I've just been talking about. But if an organization is minded to report more frequently, they can. The tool allows that, and you can choose that when you go in. And in some respects, it makes it more fluid and easier to report on a more regular basis because you're doing it drip by drip. You're not waiting until the end of the year and doing it in one big batch. But we do understand that there are lots of reporting constraints on suppliers and contractors. So we're trying to be, again, flexible to different demands, different needs. And finally, because it's an online tool, any online tool these days has a dashboard, and our tool is no different. There are dashboards for seeing how your data is split out and how it is apportioned to those different clients. And you can see where your hotspots are, whether it's from your transport, for example, or from your electricity consumption. And that gives you that kind of information to understand, well, okay, where should we be focusing on in our reduction strategy? And this is just a quick snapshot of the tool. It's fairly standard, fairly straightforward. You get a list of activity data as it's known in the jargon: diesel, gas, oil, natural gas in this example, and then you plug in your data, crank the handle, and out comes the carbon number. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to quickly go through where we might get some of that data from. So we know why we're doing it. It's fairly clear. We know what we need to do in terms of mandatory reporting, but also some of the voluntary mechanisms. We've had a little bit of a canter through some of the jargon that we should all know about in terms of scopes and global warming potential. But where does that information actually come from? You know, you're ready. Who do I go and talk to basically to get that information? So this next few slides talks to where that information might come from. So your scope 1 is your business. Essentially, what are you controlling? And I've mentioned some of this in brief already. So those assets and facilities that you own and control, whether it's mobile, like a vehicle, or plant and equipment that you own and control, or whether it's your buildings and other utilities as well, particularly fugitive emissions. So that's the example I gave earlier of air conditioning systems having leaks. That's in your control as well. That's your scope 1. Your scope 2 and 3 is your indirect emissions. So that's from your suppliers. Now, your supplier includes your electricity company that you buy from, your water company, your waste contractor, the suppliers who provide you materials, your subcontractors who provide you services, business travel as well. So all of those other things. And then, as I mentioned earlier, downstream to your customers and your clients, what they might be doing with the products you sell to them and how they use them. So that makes it incumbent on you to understand how to make your products and service as efficient as possible, because they're ultimately going to be calculating their carbon emissions, of which you contribute some to into their scope 3. And in terms of boundaries, again, this is kind of putting that picture on when I talked earlier about scope 1, 2, and 3 in your SCCR reporting and so on. Those 2 red boxes cover your scope 1 and 2. Those are what you're going to have to gather data for to contribute to that reporting mechanism, be it voluntary or mandatory. Business travel is often included. It's kind of expected in many cases because normally you can get access to your business travel data relatively easy, albeit it's in scope 3. The same with commuting data. If you want to include commuting of colleagues to a particular site, that's part of your scope 3 as well. And then all the materials and the third-party logistics, the waste contractor, the water company as well, that all comes in your other scope 3. Those are undeniably harder to get data for, but there are mechanisms and ways of gathering that information and being able to provide a robust picture of what your emissions are. And just a couple of phrases there. You might have heard of embodied carbon. Again, this is useful for carbon reporting. If people talk about reporting your embodied carbon, you're essentially looking at your supply chain, what's embodied within the materials and products you buy, the components you buy in, but also what's embodied within the services you buy from your suppliers and your contractors as well. Whereas operational carbon is what you're doing yourself, you're on your sites, in your offices and so on. And then sometimes end user carbon is mentioned as well if you have a client, a customer who's using your product. So where does that data come from? There's various sources you can see on the screen, and what I want to get across here in terms of your carbon reporting is that you will need to build relationships with lots of people in your organization and outside your organization to get the data you need to do your carbon reporting, whether it's SECR or whether it's SBT. So you can see your own fuels consumption, your electricity consumption, business travel, materials, suppliers, logistics, and so on. So here's some of the kinds of data that you might need in that top set of bullet points. When we're looking at data, we're looking at litres of fuel, kilowatt hours of gas or electric, mileage travelled, various metrics for the amount of material that you consume, and also an indication below of where that information might come from. So those kinds of functions within your organisation, but outside. So it's really key. Reporting is one part of this, but it's understanding where the information resides, whose door you're going to knock on fundamentally to say, have you got data on such and such? So your procurement team is a good friend to have in this, particularly with the scope 3 part I talked about, where 80–90% of your impact will be in your supply chain. Procurement and commercial will have the relationships and probably a lot of information as well for you to go to. But of course, closer to home, you've got your own estates management team, your own fleet management team, who will have information on what you're using in your own assets and facilities. So building up that picture of who your stakeholders is a key part of this, as well as ultimately finally submitting that report to Director's House. Couple of key pointers as well about the kinds of information you might get. It'd be a wonderful world if everyone said, oh yes, here's a lovely spreadsheet with all my litre consumption over the last 12 months. Doesn't always happen like that. So you might have to think a bit creatively about where you get your information from. There's billing, there's invoicing, there's meter reads, but then you might also have to use proxy data. You might not have the actual litres or kilowatt hours. You might have the amount of money spent. So you'll need to be able to think about, well, how can I convert that into something that's useful for my carbon reporting? Similarly, you might have to think about sampling data. It might just be too onerous or just not possible to gather all the information for every single site on every month of the year to pull together your inventory. You might have to do a sampling system and scale up with suitable caveats and explanation assumptions, but you might have to do some scaling up exercise as well. So think a bit creatively if you need to about where that information might come from and how you might manipulate it. Also think about the reliability of the data. It's kind of buyer beware. Your own information, make sure it's the right information that you have. Make sure your suppliers and contractors are giving you information that's relevant to their product. It's not some kind of global average number that is kind of half relevant but not suitably relevant. We've had many examples in the past where people have provided data from the US. So it's the right product, yes, it's the right kind of process, but it's very much USA-centric data, so therefore it's not maybe as applicable to the UK situation. If you've got no other data, that might be what you have to go with, but question those kinds of things before you just kind of blithely accept them. Question where the data comes from. Is it reliable? Is it up to date? Check when it was produced. Many examples where we see environmental product declarations, the data might have expired, the EPD might have expired, so just check about the validity of the data. Key things that you do in any data sampling exercise. I mentioned the GHG protocol. This slide is really just to give you a picture of what it looks like when you go Googling for it. It really is a definitive standard. The ISO standard is very similar as well. Many organizations, as I say, use a GHG protocol. It's very comprehensive, but it's an easy read to work your way through the process of how you gather your data, how you set your boundaries, and how you collect the information and then analyze it as well. So it's really important to have an understanding of what that looks like. I'm not expecting you to read this slide by any means. Like I say, Sophie will share the slides afterwards with you, but it gives you a bit of a reference point from many of the data sources that are out there and available for free in terms of gathering data, calculating emissions and reporting your data. The ones near the top give you some of those conversion factors for converting, for example, a litre of diesel, how much carbon dioxide is kicked out from a litre of diesel. Those ones at the top will give you that information on how you do that. And then there are other references to calculators and tools that can help you do that as well. The ones we've put there are all free. There are others out there that you have to pay for, of course, but you know, as the school is minded to, these are the free ones that you can, or some of the free ones that you can access. And I suppose the last comment I'd like to make is that reporting is important. and compliance definitely, and keeping your customer happy definitely, but there are lots of other reasons for understanding what your carbon emissions are, where your hotspots are, and therefore what you're going to do about it. It's not just about working out we emit 100,000 tons of carbon each year and the majority of it is in our production facility. That's great, but that's only rung one of the ladder of going up towards reduced carbon emissions. Having that baseline is key, but it'll help you with so many other things, and you can see some of them on the screen now. So compliance, definitely, that always ticks a box within any organization, but there are bigger reasons as well, that the financial savings, work winning, being ahead of regulation, being up there with your peers and competitors are all important. So it's not just about making sure you get your submission on time to SECR or one of the other ones. There's so much more to it than that. As I say, there are other workshops that we do within the supply chain school on the various aspects I've touched upon today. We go into a lot more detail about scopes and about the greenhouse gas protocol and so on. So if you're interested in those, keep an eye out for what's available. And that's it. 4 minutes to go. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that useful. Like I say, Sophie will circulate the slides for you to refer to in the next few days. But thank you.